Hello, scholars. My name is Dr. Kara Stillen, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. Our last video discussed the actions taken by both the British and the American colonists that led up to the Revolutionary War. This video is going to discuss the Revolutionary War itself. The incidents with the British at Lexington and Concord made it obvious that there needed to be a second Continental Congress. On May 10, 1775, colonial leaders came together in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The leaders knew they needed to talk about raising and funding an army, finding a leader to command that army, and declare war against the British. They also wanted to discuss a possible path to reconciliation with the British, but when the king refused to have any discussions with the colonists, this meant the colonists knew they'd have to declare their own independence from the British. This act alone would be considered an act of treason against the British government. It was difficult for the leaders of each colony to trust one another. There were leaders that were radical, such as Samuel and John Adams. They pushed for complete independence from the British. Other leaders were moderate and just wanted some type of path in which the British could still be involved in their future. Many leaders did not trust Benjamin Franklin, who attended the Second Continental Congress after being in London for the past 10 years. Many individuals worried that Franklin was a British spy. The delegates continued to debate independence from the British, and on June 14, 1775, the Continental Congress finally voted in approval to form a Continental Army. It was obvious who the delegates would want as their commander: George Washington. By choosing Washington as the commander, this sent a message to the British that the colonies were aligned. Thomas Jefferson then wrote a declaration on the causes of necessity of taking up arms, and edits were made by John Dickinson, who thought it was just too extreme. The Continental Congress also agreed to fund the Army with $2 million by issuing its own currency and then declared war on the British. Before the Continental Congress could organize an army, British Commander Thomas Gage received troop reinforcements and planned a major offensive against the rebels. Americans learned of his offensive in fortified areas around Charleston, which was north of Boston. On the night of June 16, 1775, there were 1,400 American soldiers that positioned themselves on the tops of the hills. General Howe sent 2,500 British soldiers up the hill in a direct attack against the Americans. The Americans waited until the British soldiers were very close and then began firing. The British troops fell in hordes. The rest turned around and fled. General Howe again sent a second wave of soldiers back up the hill, and they were blasted. There were dead British soldiers everywhere. General Howe refused to give up and sent a third wave up the hill. The only reason the British were able to get all the way up the hill this time was because the Americans had started to run out of ammunition. 226 British soldiers died and 800 were wounded. 114 American soldiers died and 271 were wounded. The American soldiers retreated when the British finally were able to scale the hill, and General Howe refused to follow them with his soldiers. He and his troops traveled back to Boston. General Howe knew he needed to spend some time inoculating his British troops to smallpox. Soldiers were inoculated and would suffer from a small case of smallpox, but this would mean that they would be immune to it in the future. A wave of smallpox was spreading all over the colonies, and General Howe knew this could devastate his troops if he didn't spend time inoculating them. Meanwhile, colonial men were brought together in an effort to create the Continental Army. When Commander George Washington arrived, he was surprised at how undisciplined the men were and how they were very unsanitary conditions at the camp. Washington put into place a hierarchy, which the men took to very quickly because they were enthusiastic and wanted to fight the British. In January of 1776, a pamphlet titled Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, was published and circulated in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This pamphlet questioned why a monarch, born into their status, knew how to lead others better than an elected representative. Paine argued for America to be a Republican government in which the people would decide on its rules and its way of life. He also talked about the need for elections, which meant people's decisions would be based on a direct vote of what they wanted. This pamphlet became so popular that Americans read it in bars and coffee shops. The delegates did realize that getting help from countries outside of Britain would definitely help. France agreed to help the American colonies by providing some supplies and naval assistance. The French hesitated to help the Americans, though, until they knew they would not be returning to the British monarch. The colonists were appalled, though, when they heard the British had hired German military soldiers to fight against them. In June, Richard Lee proposed a resolution for independence from the British, and it was put off for a month so that the delegates could talk with their colonies about it. The resolution was brought up again in July, and all but one state voted for independence. The state that did not vote for independence from the British was New York. Thomas Jefferson then introduced his document calling for independence from the British. The preamble of the document discussed natural rights, having the consent of the governed, the right of the people to revolt, as well as the equality of all people. These were seen by many as self-evident truths that all people should have access to. After a month of further revisions, delegates signed the handwritten copy of his document. There were 4 delegates that refused to sign the document. Once it was finished, it was printed and then distributed to all the colonies. It was at a reading of this document in the streets of New York that a crowd cheered and pushed over a statue of a monarch and melted it for bullets. No longer did those in New York refuse to sign this document. The vote for independence became unanimous amongst the colonies. Even though the delegates had all agreed to independence, there were still many colonists that wanted reunification with the British. Those that still wanted reunification were called Loyalists, as they were still loyal to the British government. Sometimes it was difficult to know which colonists were on the side of independence versus those that were loyal to the crown. There were many challenges for both the British and the American soldiers during the first year of war. The British were concerned about being able to feed and shelter their soldiers. Huge ships of supplies were sent from the British, and the farther away from these ships the soldiers went, the more difficult it was to keep everyone fed. Commands had been given not to set fire to or steal the supplies of the colonists because Britain wanted to gain control again and continue to profit from the raw materials. American troops did not really understand how to be soldiers. There was a Continental Army that was formed, but there were also town militias that every male 16 years of age or older were expected to be part of. The Army made the mistake of only asking its men to enlist for 1 year, and this didn't give the Army enough time to train and send these men into battle. The Army then offered a 3-year enlistment that provided a $20 bonus to those that agreed to fight the whole war and were promised 100 acres of land. Over the first year, the British attacked from the north and eventually made it to New York. The Americans fought back and attempted to push the British back into Canada. Back and forth, both sides pushed north and south across New Jersey. Both armies had women, and they were nurses and cooks for the soldiers. Many of the women in the American Army were the wives of the soldiers, and their children ran around the military camp. It was normal for women to give birth on the side of the road as the Army traveled from one place to another. At first, blacks were not allowed in the Continental Army, but as the war continued on, about 5,000 black men eventually served. When black men signed up for the Army, they often offered their names as Freeman, Freedom, or Liberty. The Continental Congress continued to meet as the Revolutionary War progressed. They knew the British would love to capture these leaders, and so they moved their meetings to various places so no one knew where they met. The goal of the British was to capture port cities in the colonies so they could bring their supply ships to those areas. The first goal was to capture New York and to gather British Loyalists to turn against the rebels and put pressure on them. In 1775, American soldiers went north to capture Montreal and Quebec. Montreal was taken easily by American soldiers and their commander, General Richard Montgomery. Quebec was a struggle. Colonel Benedict Arnold marched American soldiers through freezing rain and many men died. There were multiple failures to attack and gain Quebec. In August of 1776, 45,000 British soldiers arrived south of New York City. Their commander was General Howe. George Washington knew Howe would probably do this, so he moved 20,000 of his men south of Massachusetts. The Battle of Long Island soon took place. The British troops killed 1,500 American soldiers quite easily. American soldiers retreated west. General Howe did not go after the American soldiers, and Washington led his troops in retreat to Manhattan Island. In the next couple of weeks, Washington took his troops further north along the Hudson River to two different forts. General Howe attacked the forts and eventually captured 3,000 prisoners. General Howe decided to set up his German soldiers along the Delaware River. General Howe was very confident that the Americans would not attack him. On December 25th at night, as sleet fell from the sky, Washington and his soldiers moved across the Delaware River and quickly captured the German soldiers at Trenton. A victory by the Americans was celebrated within the colonies. Washington continued to strike against the British units at Princeton, and then he and his troops settled for the winter in New Jersey. This is where American soldiers were given smallpox inoculations so they could be ready for the spring. As American men went off to war, women took care of more of the responsibilities within the home. Abigail Adams managed the family farm while her husband was involved in politics. Other women managed southern plantations. Ladies' associations collected money for the Continental soldiers. If colonists were found to be Loyalists, the Continental Congress declared them to be traitors in 1775. Traitors could receive house arrest, have their voting rights taken away, could have their property taken away, or could even be deported. Some traitors were tarred and feathered. The Continental Congress borrowed gold and silver coins from wealthy men in exchange for later repayment with interest. The Continental Congress also provided land grants within Maine and Ohio. In 1777, the British moved from Quebec, Canada, south in an attempt to again take over the New England colonies. The Continental Army headed north and moved directly into central New York. British General John Burgoyne led an army of British soldiers south from Canada. General Burgoyne traveled with a huge amount of food and many of his own belongings. As the British moved south, they took Fort Ticonderoga with no issues. This was because the Americans retreated away from the forts when they saw the huge number of British soldiers headed toward them. The British continued south through various forests. The British didn't anticipate how difficult this terrain would be, and they lost about 30 days of travel because of it. Supplies of food were not adequate either, which meant the British had to try and find food within the forest, and this is where town militiamen attacked the British using guerrilla tactics. In August of 1777, General Howe attacked Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This was a huge surprise to the colonists. British General Ledger took troops toward Albany, thinking that this could be an easy battle for him and his men. On their way, though, a small group of American soldiers at Fort Stanwix fought very hard against the British. They refused to surrender, and the militiamen from surrounding towns came to assist the Continental Army. General Ledger, along with Mohawk Chief Joseph Brant, used a ravine, though, and waited for the militiamen to stop and allow their animals to drink from the waters. And this is when the British fired upon the Americans, killing almost 500 out of the 840 soldiers. This fight was named the Battle of Oriskany. The British finally left the area at Fort Stanwix when American General Benedict Arnold stopped General Burgoyne's supplies from reaching him, and he and his troops became isolated in the town of Saratoga. 7,000 American troops in Albany under the leadership of General Horatio Gates started towards Saratoga. Burgoyne did not want to be attacked by them, though. He decided to attack first. When they finally came face to face, 600 British soldiers were killed. The Continental Army continued to attack, and another 600 British soldiers were killed. General Burgoyne finally surrendered on October 17, 1777. It was at this point that Americans started to believe they could win the war against the British. Some colonists believed the war could be finished within half a year. The British tried to negotiate a peace treaty with the Americans, but refused to give them independence. The Americans decided there was no way they were going to agree to this. During the winter of 1777, Commander George Washington moved his troops to Valley Forge, just west of Philadelphia. The winter was especially harsh, and 2,000 of the American troops died of various diseases there. Another 2,000 American soldiers left the fort because of its poor conditions. While battles near the coast were cooling down, battles on the frontier with the Native American tribes began heating up. In the fall of 1777 to the summer of 1778, British Loyalists and Native American tribes attacked farms and killed their inhabitants. Native American tribes killed townspeople and took persons captive. Commander Washington and General John Sullivan allowed troops to take out Iroquois villages and loot Native American communities. Troops burned cornfields and fruit orchards. Many of the Native Americans fled north to Fort Niagara, where the British were located. Many camped outside of the fort during the horrible winter and lost their lives. Native American tribes that did side with the Continental Army were usually double-crossed, and their chiefs were often killed. Those that started out on the side of the American colonists often switched sides and fought alongside the British. The frontier battles continued, and in 1778, the battles along the Atlantic coast started to heat up again. It was during this year that the French finally signed an alliance with America. The French stated that they would give the Americans full military support as well as use their navy against the British. Disrupting British supplies would definitely cause the British to struggle on all fronts. The American colonists recognized this alliance would eventually lead to good trading relationships. The British were extremely concerned when they learned of America's alliance with the French. Britain's prime minister, along with a majority of its generals, wanted to see the war finished. The monarch refused to call it quits and devised a plan to move troops to the south, where he could gain loyalties and move north with more troops. The monarch believed the supplies in the south and the slaves would bring about a change in the war. Georgia fell quickly to the British in December of 1778. The Continental Army did not know the British were headed south, so they didn't anticipate this particular move. The Continental Army sent 10 regiments to Charleston to prepare for the attack by the British of South Carolina. The British were able to take the city by May of 1780, and they took 3,300 colonists as prisoners. The rest of the colonists had to swear loyalty to the British and take up arms if they were asked to in order to stay in their homes. It was during this time that an American general started working with the British. His name was Benedict Arnold. It was unknown the exact reason why Arnold became an American traitor, but many believed he sought fame and wanted more honor for his role in the war and wasn't receiving it. General Arnold had secret communications with a British general providing information for money. In 1780, Americans confiscated the plans that Arnold had sent to a British general, and colonists were astounded by Arnold's lack of loyalty toward the new nation. The military and colonists used Arnold's treason to create a new form of morale among the soldiers and patriotism with its people. British soldiers were hit extremely hard by guerrilla warfare in South Carolina. Town militia attacked British soldiers and then ran away. They burned property and territory so that the British could not benefit in any way. North Carolina and Georgia caught on to the guerrilla warfare and started attacking British soldiers from all sides. The British troops were terrorized by individuals that they didn't even get to see. When British commanders realized that North Carolina was supplying South Carolina with weapons and soldiers, British troops moved into North Carolina. When 1,400 American riflemen massacred Loyalist units at the Battle of Kings Mountain, British troops were forced to return to South Carolina. A defeat of the British in January of 1781 was also extremely devastating. A British raiding party went to Charlesville to capture members of the Virginian Assembly, but Governor Thomas Jefferson had left 10 minutes early and had not been captured. British General Cornwallis then moved his troops into Yorktown, hoping for more troops to arrive by ship in New York City, which was still held by the British. It was at this point that the French finally arrived to help the Americans. Commander Comte de Rochambeau joined Commander Washington in Rhode Island and headed toward the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. A French group of ships arrived there before the British arrived. The French Navy battled the British Navy and took control of the Virginian coast. British General Cornwallis and 7,500 troops faced off against 16,000 French and American soldiers. The French and Americans fired upon the British for 12 days. The British had very little ammunition and food left. Before their surrender, the British killed off hundreds of horses and pushed them into the rivers. The rivers ran red with the corpses of horses as they floated down the waters. The British didn't want America to gain anything from their surrender. On October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered. In 1783, 27,000 British soldiers and 30,000 Loyalist colonists boarded hundreds of ships headed for England. Before the British officially left Manhattan, soldiers raised the British flag in Manhattan, greased the flagpole, as well as cut the rope that allowed the flag to be brought down. That is my favorite true story of the Revolutionary War for sure. I hope you liked this video as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, please click that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or night, whatever it is for you in the world. Signing off.